Welcome back to the closing edition of America's Voice for Energy. We've been talking today about Resolute forest products, and we've talked about different aspects of this case. We've had Patrick Moore talking to us about kind of the history of Greenpeace and how they transformed and have attacked Resolute forest products. We've had Michael Bowe talk to us about the lawsuit that Resolute has filed against Greenpeace. We've had Yana I've got to remember how to say her name, sorry, Warsession, there we are, Yana Warsession talking about how the companies like Resolute can take the moral high ground. And for our final segment today, I'm pleased to have with us Peter Foster, who is a columnist with the Financial Post, has written extensively on Resolute, and he's also the author of 20 books. And his most recent is Why We Bite the Invisible Hand, available on Amazon.com. And he's working on a new one called Resource Wars, of which the Resolute story is a part. So, Peter, thanks for taking time out of your busy day to join us on America's Voice for Energy.
Oh, you're welcome, Marita. Thanks very much. But I have to correct you. I think you're the one who's written 20 books. I've only written 9, I'm afraid.
Oh, sorry about that. I was giving you a lot more credit.
Yes, too much credit, yes.
Well, thanks for that little correction. It's I've got written down on my notes 9 books. Did I say 20? Sorry about that.
Yes, no. But I think you've written 20 books, right?
Yeah, that is accurate. But I'm sure you will write 20, so maybe it's prophetic.
I live that long, thanks, yes.
So tell us, you've covered this story, this Greenpeace Resolute Forest Product story. I think in my research, your work came up more than anyone else's. So I'm hoping for our listeners today, you can wrap this up and kind of tell us when this happened, when did the attacks happen, what's the result, where do you think this is going to go, whatever you want to say about this story, because you're
sure.
very involved in it.
I started looking at this general topic of environmental NGOs shaking down corporations more than a decade ago. It started with forest ethics, which is party to this suit that Resolute is bringing. When Forest Ethics staged an assault on Victoria's Secret, the lingerie company. And it announced that after 2 years of research, it had found that Victoria's Secret catalogues were made from paper, and paper came from trees, and trees grew in forests. And it claimed that the paper that Victoria's Secret was using came from the endangered old-growth boreal forest. And it staged, it had ads in the New York Times with a sort of new Victoria's Secret model wielding a chainsaw. It had people chaining themselves literally to the New York store of Victoria's Secret. And in the end, Victoria's Secret simply gave in. It stopped taking wood from a Canadian company, and it put up $1 million for research and advocacy purposes. So Forest Ethics had won an enormous victory. And then it proceeded to repeat that with various other companies, threatening them with destroying their reputations, and whereupon they would give in and do what Forest Ethics said. My interest in Resolute began as a result of an extension of this activity. There was a thing called the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement in 2010, when a bunch of forestry companies, including Resolute, signed a deal with groups including Greenpeace and Forest Ethics. And the essence of the deal was that the environmental NGOs said they would ease off with their negative campaigning, their do not buy campaigns against these companies, if the companies agreed to sit down with them. So the companies agreed to do a deal which essentially sanitized an area of the boreal forest twice the size of Germany. And I
just want to clarify. Yes. I just want to clarify, because I didn't understand this when I first started writing on this story myself, that saying that you're going to sanitize a section of the forest basically means you're putting it off limits for economic development. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, which means that, it cannot provide jobs. What do the people who live in the forest do? But this was of no concern to environmental NGOs. But as I say, the most objectionable thing about the agreement was that it was essentially, it came about as a result of intimidation from environmental NGOs. And in fact, I wrote at the time that it set a terrible precedent, because not only did it not consult with people who lived in the forest, local communities and Aboriginal groups, even governments weren't involved. So what it amounted to was a sort of non-governmental regulation of one of the best managed forests in the world, which, by the way, is absolutely huge. The idea that the boreal forest is endangered is ridiculous. It's 13 times the size of California. So anyway,
wow.
I suggested that this was a terrible, terrible agreement, and in fact it turned out to be a terrible agreement. But my interest in Resolute, as I say, one of the signatories, didn't really appear until 3 years later, when the agreement was about to expire, and Greenpeace broke away and started attacking Resolute for, it claimed, flouting the conditions of the agreement. Now, usually companies give in under the circumstances because they don't want their brands damaged, but Resolute, under Richard Garneau, its CEO, who I've described as a corporate hero, actually fought back and pointed out that they were talking nonsense, established they were talking nonsense, and amazingly, Greenpeace actually apologized. They acknowledged they were talking nonsense, but then they went back to peddling the same old lies and a bunch of additional lies as well. Thinking, of course, that Resolute would be like other corporations and simply stand down. And indeed, it was coming under pressure from its fellows, from other Canadian companies who were concerned that they didn't want these do-not-buy campaigns to start up again. But Resolute stood firm, and it sued Greenpeace in the end, which is astonishing. I mean, I said in the column, this is the equivalent of man bites dog in terms of newsworthiness, although it received remarkably little coverage. So anyway, Greenpeace has now been writhing for 2 years to avoid coming to court in Canada, but its day of judgment seems to be coming closer. And now, as
do you think that lawsuit, as I wrote in my column, that they keep doing everything they can to delay that? Where do you think that lawsuit is?
Yes, I mean, it is proceeding towards court. They've made a number of objections which have been overturned by various levels of court in Canada, and I think that, they're very keen to. Obviously, they don't want to come to court. They've been claiming this is all about bullying by Resolute, but it's not. It's about truth and justice, and the fact that Greenpeace has been damaging Resolute's business and destroying jobs, and that should not be allowed. And what amazes me is that it has been allowed to go on for so long. So, and then of course they brought this RICO suit in the U.S., which is upping the ante again, and I think stands to be a landmark case.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is a landmark case, and hopefully others will follow that. So do you have any idea how they decided to go with a RICO charge? It seems a little bit dramatic.
Well, it's often claimed that RICO cases are inappropriately used, but in this particular case, Greenpeace can hardly complain about the misuse of RICO, since it suggested that RICO be used against ExxonMobil for allegedly sowing doubt about climate change. Well, of course, since climate change, or to give it its correct name, projected man-made catastrophic climate change is just a theory. You cannot hide the truth about it because there is no truth. It's still a theory which is in the, we do not understand the science of the climate, but you're not allowed to say that. But anyway, so Greenpeace has suggested, as part of a more general witch hunt against ExxonMobil, that RICO be used against it, so it can hardly complain about RICO being used against it. And RICO seems somewhat appropriate because, as you probably know, it was originally concocted at the beginning of the 20th century as a measure against the mob, which is a sort of loosely connected organization with a common pattern of activity that engages in nefarious activities, in this case, extortion. And I think it's very clear that that's exactly what Greenpeace and Forest Ethics, which is now called STAND, and various other radical environmental NGOs have been doing. They've been engaged in extortion.
Yeah, and they really have been engaged in extortion, and that's why in my piece I, like you, applauded Resolute for their taking a stand and being bold about this. There's a gentleman you may know, and if you don't know, you might want to look him up. He's on the board of my organization, the Citizens Alliance for Responsible Energy. His name is Jim Chilton, and he is a rancher in Arizona, and not as a corporation, but as an individual little rancher. He fought the Center for Biological Diversity. They had falsified photos and defamed him, and he fought the Center for Biological Diversity and received a $600,000 judgment. Now, rancher Jim Chilton told me he spent far more than that in the case, but was happy to do so to put them in their place. And to my knowledge, that's the only other victory along the lines of what we're talking about here.
Yes, and as I say, corporations usually shy from this kind of controversy. They give in because I think it was Mark Twain is meant to have said that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is doing up its shoelaces. Well, in this case, with social media, a lie can travel around the world instantly before you've even thought about doing up your shoelaces. So this thing has to be attacked at its root, and I think Resolute has been definitely damaged by this to the tune of at least $100 million. In fact, Greenpeace itself admits that. So they've admitted that they're trying to destroy Resolute's business, and they've put a figure on it. And now this is going to come back to haunt them, I think, as it should. And as you say,
yes, because Resolute is asking for treble damages, which means they would get 3 times that potentially.
Yes, as I understand it, that's the way the RICO is organized. And as you say, I think this may be a good example for other companies. Perhaps other companies will now stand up, because all too many of them have sort of fallen in with this idea of sustainable development and corporate social responsibility, and constantly bow before the demands of environmental, non-governmental organizations who essentially create no wealth and are in the business of destroying wealth.
Yes. And we talked about that with Jana Warsession, that very idea. So, Peter, we're out of time. I appreciate you taking your time today to join us. We've got about 30 seconds. You want to tell us about your new book, Resource Wars?
Yes, well, I mean, the Resolute case, in fact, made me decide I should write a book on the resource wars because, as you may know, there's been an enormous attack on the oil sands in Canada.
Yes.
And
yes, I've been there to the oil sands.
Yes, and the blocking of the Keystone XL pipeline, which President Obama turned down, is part of this. And there's been an enormous campaign, which is funded by a lot of American foundations, to stop development in Canada. And I think that needs exposing, and that's what I plan to expose.
Well, good. Well, we appreciate it. I hope folks will check out your books on Amazon.com. We've been talking with Peter Foster, a columnist for the Financial Times out of Montreal. Thanks for sharing the story of Resolute with us. And, folks, I hope you'll join us again next week for another edition of America's Voice for Energy. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to America'sWebRadio.com, the pioneer and leader in chat radio. Thank you for listening.